The snow fell in thick, silent flurries, a soft, unending shroud over the broken landscape of the Ardennes. It was a silence that was not peaceful, but heavy, a vacuum left in the wake of thunder. In a foxhole carved from the frozen earth, Private Samuel Ellison clutched his M1 Garand, not for comfort, but to feel the solid, cold reality of it. His breath plumed in the sub-zero air, each exhale a ghostly signal in the twilight. Hours ago, this forest had been a cacophony of screaming meme eyes and the ripping sound of German MG-42s. Now, there was only the wind, whispering through the pines, and the occasional, distant crump of artillery, a sound so routine it had become part of the silence. His fingers, numb inside his gloves, brushed against a frozen patch on the edge of his hole. It wasn't mud. It was darker, a rusty brown, soaked into the soil and frozen solid. A few feet away, partially buried by a fresh dusting of snow, lay a single, discarded object, a German Stahlhelm, its side dented by something with terrible force. There was no body, just the helmet, and the stain, and the overwhelming, deafening quiet. This was the reality of war, not in the explosion, but in the terrible, empty stillness that followed. The story was not in the battle itself, but in the objects left behind, the frozen memories, the questions hanging in the frigid air. This channel is a memorial to those silences, to the stories whispered by the frozen ground and the abandoned relics. If you wish to join us in this duty of memory, to ensure these echoes are not lost to the wind, please consider subscribing. The order came down not as a shout, but as a low murmur passed from man to man, a current of confusion and grim anticipation. They were moving out, not toward the front where the big guns still grumbled, but east, into a part of Germany the maps labeled with harmless-sounding names. For Samuel and the rest of the ragged, mud-caked column, it was just another movement in a war that had become a series of frozen marches and sudden, violent eruptions. They trudged through villages that seemed untouched by time, their white-walled houses and tidy cobblestone streets a surreal mockery of the world they had left behind in the Hürtgen forest. The civilians they passed averted their eyes, a collective gesture of fear and shame that Samuel couldn't yet decipher. It was the smell that first signaled the change. At first, it was just a faint acridity on the wind, like distant burning leaves. But with every mile, it grew stronger, coiling into a thick, greasy pall that stained the air itself, a nauseating cocktail of burnt hair, chemical lime, and something profoundly organic, something that spoke of a corruption on a scale the young private from Ohio could not comprehend. The men fell silent, the usual grumbling and dark jokes ceasing altogether. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the gravel road, the rattling of their gear, and the low rumble of the tanks that flanked them, their commanders standing tall in the turrets, their faces grim masks under their helmets. They crested a small hill, and the world changed. Before them lay not a military installation with watchtowers and barbed wire, though those were there in abundance, but a vast, sprawling city of bleak, identical barracks, stretching out to a horizon blurred by the smoke from several large, industrial chimneys. The air here was thick with flakes of ash that were not snow, and the smell was now a physical presence, coating the back of the throat, clinging to wool uniforms, a stench that would, they all knew instinctively, never truly wash out. The main gate, a monstrous arch of iron, stood open, as if in a mockery of welcome. Through it, they could see a motionless sea of humanity, figures clad in crude, striped pajamas, standing, staring, or simply lying in the mud where they had fallen. Their eyes were the worst, enormous, hollowed-out sockets in skeletal faces, reflecting a depth of suffering that rendered the advancing soldiers, these liberators with their powerful machines of war, utterly silent. An officer barked an order, his voice tight and strained, and the column fanned out, the men moving with a cautious, almost reverent slowness, their rifles held not at the ready, but lowered, as if ashamed of their own power in this place of absolute powerlessness. Samuel's squad was directed toward a long, low-slung building near the perimeter. Its doors were heavy wood, reinforced with iron bands, and from within came a low, collective moaning, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth. He pushed one open, and the darkness inside swallowed the gray daylight. His eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, and the scene that resolved itself would be seared into his memory forever. Rows of wooden bunks, 3 and 4 high, were crammed with living skeletons. There was no movement, only the slow, labored breathing of creatures hovering on the very brink of extinction. A man on a lower bunk, his head a skull with skin stretched taut over it, looked at Samuel, and his hand, a claw of bone and tendon, slowly rose, not in a plea for food or water, but simply as if to confirm the reality of this new apparition, this soldier from another world who stood frozen in the doorway. The floor was slick with filth, and the air was thick with the smell of dysentery and decay. Samuel felt his stomach clench, his mind refusing to process the evidence of his senses. This was not the hero's welcome he had sometimes, in his most foolish moments, imagined. This was a descent into hell, and they were not its conquerors, but merely witnesses to a crime that had already been completed. He stumbled back out into the light, gasping for air that was no cleaner, his body trembling not from the cold, but from a shock that reached down to his soul. He leaned against the rough-hewn wall of the barracks, trying to steady himself, and that's when he saw it, half-trodden into the mud, a small, cloth-bound book, its pages swollen with dampness. He bent down, his movements slow and automatic, and picked it up. The cover was stained with mud and something darker. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with a tight, precise script, in a language he didn't understand, but interspersed with dates and numbers that told their own story. January 17, 1945. The cold is inside us now. Carol did not wake this morning. They took his body, but his spoon remains. A treasure. Samuel flipped a few pages, his numb fingers fumbling. March 2nd. A transport arrived from the east. They went straight to the line, without even the pretense of selection. The smoke is constant. We are living in the breath of the dead. He closed the book, holding it as if it were a live grenade. This was not a military report or a general's memoir. This was a voice from the grave, a chronicle of the world he had just entered, written from the inside. He tucked it into his jacket, against his chest, a secret had they been fighting against, that such a place could not only exist, but function with such brutal, industrial efficiency for years on end. The question had no answer, only the vast, imposing silence of the camp, broken now by the first, tentative sounds of weeping as the reality of liberation began to dawn on those who had the strength left to feel it. The soldiers moved like ghosts themselves, handing out their K-ration crackers and chocolate, their hands shaking as they offered canteens to lips that could no longer form words. The power of the American war machine, the Shermans and the half-tracks and the disciplined infantry, meant nothing here. The only currency was humanity, and they felt bankrupt. Samuel watched as a medic, his face pale and streaked with tears, gently wrapped a survivor in a blanket, the man weighing less than a child. He saw a tough, veteran sergeant vomit into a ditch, his big shoulders heaving with sobs he could no longer contain. This was the true face of the enemy they had crossed an ocean to defeat. It was not a soldier in a gray uniform, but an idea, a cold, bureaucratic philosophy of death, implemented with typewriters and train schedules and the unyielding logic of the abattoir. The camp was a complex, a system, and its product was corpses. And as the sun began to set, casting long, sinister shadows across the compound, Samuel understood that the war they had known was over. A new one had just begun, the war to understand, to bear witness, to live with the knowledge of this absolute evil. And in the pocket over his heart, the diary felt as heavy as a tombstone. The diary became a secret weight in Samuel's tunic, a cold, damp stone against his heart that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. They had been ordered to secure the perimeter, to stand guard over this city of the dead, but there was no enemy to fight, only the lingering, ghostly presence of the architects of this horror who had vanished like cowards before the advance. The work was grim and methodical. They helped the medics from the forward units as they arrived, their faces masks of professional composure that quickly shattered upon entering the barracks. The living were separated from the dead, a task that required a definition of life Samuel was no longer sure he possessed. He saw men so emaciated that a gentle touch would leave a bruise that bloomed like a dark flower on their parchment skin, their bodies having consumed all fat and muscle, now feeding on something else, something essential that kept the spark of consciousness flickering in their sunken eyes. He helped carry stretchers, the occupants weighing so little that it felt like carrying empty uniforms, and each time he bent down, the diary shifted in his pocket, a silent reminder of the individual voice trapped within this vast, anonymous suffering. At night, in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp inside a commandeered SS barracks office, he would take it out, the pages fragile as autumn leaves, and stare at the script. He couldn't read the words, but he didn't need to. The very formation of the letters, the desperate cling to order in the face of chaos, told its own story. It was a testament, a direct line into the mind of someone who had documented the unraveling of their own world. Days blurred into a continuous, nauseating rhythm. The initial shock did not fade, it mutated, hardening into a cold, sharp rage that lived just beneath the skin of every soldier. They watched as bulldozers, machines designed for construction, were tasked with the ghastly work of corralling mountains of emaciated corpses into mass graves. The air was filled with the grinding of their engines and the sweet, putrid smell of death that no amount of quicklime could fully erase. Samuel was assigned to a detail processing the few SS guards who had been too slow or too arrogant to flee. He watched them, these men in their clean, sharp uniforms, their faces blank with a bureaucratic indifference that was more terrifying than any snarl of hatred. They followed orders, they gave their names and ranks, they seemed to exist in a separate reality, one where the mountains of dead were a logistical problem, not a moral cataclysm. One of them, a young man not much older than Samuel, with pale blue eyes and a carefully neutral expression, was being questioned by a lieutenant. The lieutenant's voice was trembling with a fury he could barely contain. Why? He kept asking, jabbing his finger toward the window, toward the horror outside. Why did you do this? The SS guard blinked, looked slightly perplexed, and gave the only answer he seemed to have, Befehl ist Befehl. An order is an order. The phrase landed not as an explanation, but as a void, an abyss of abdicated humanity that Samuel felt himself staring into. It was during one of these long, twilight hours that he found a translator, a Czech Jew who had been a professor of literature in another life and who had survived through a mixture of sheer luck and a skill for mending the guards' boots. His name was Jan, and he moved with the slow, deliberate care of a man whose body had been broken but whose mind was still fiercely alive. Samuel approached him hesitantly, holding out the diary. He didn't speak, just offered it. Jan looked at the book, then at Samuel's face, and his eyes, deep pools of old suffering, understood. He took it, his hands, though skeletal, were steady. He found a quiet corner on an overturned crate, away from the worst of the smells and sounds, and began to read, his lips moving silently. Samuel sat beside him, watching the play of emotions on the man's face, a flicker of pain, a grimace of recognition, a long, slow exhalation of sorrow. After what felt like an eternity, Jan looked up, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the gathering dusk. His name was Miklos, he said, his voice a dry rustle. A Hungarian. A watchmaker from Debrecen. He arrived on a transport in the spring of '44. He writes of the time before, the time during, he kept track of the numbers, the days, the names of those who disappeared. He was making a record. For someone. For anyone. Jan began to translate, not the entire diary, but fragments, chosen pieces that painted a picture of the camp's inner workings, its bizarre and brutal hierarchy. He read of the Sonderkommando revolts, whispered plans and the smell of burning documents as the SS tried to erase their crimes. He read of the endless, mind-numbing roll calls in the freezing dawn, of the capos with their clubs, of the tiny acts of defiance, a shared crust of bread, a secretly observed Sabbath, a name whispered in the dark to ensure it was not forgotten. Samuel listened, and the camp around him, which had seemed a chaotic nightmare, began to take on a terrible, sinister order. This was not madness, it was a system, a perverse, functioning universe with its own laws and logic, all designed for the single purpose of degradation, and it struck him the most was not one of overt horror, but of simple, profound loss. Today, I saw a bird, Miklos had written. It landed on the wire, just for a moment. A simple sparrow. It looked at me, cocked its head, and flew away. I have not seen a bird that was free in over a year. I had forgotten they existed. The others think I am crying for my family, for my lost life. I am crying for the bird. In that moment, Samuel understood that the crime was not just against the bodies, but against the very soul, against the memory of a world where sparrows flew and watchmakers fixed delicate gears, a world of small, beautiful things that had been systematically erased. He looked at Jan, who had closed the diary, his story delivered. The silence between them was not empty, it was filled with the ghost of Miklos, and the millions more like him. What words could possibly be adequate to capture the sound of a soul being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, until even the memory of a sparrow becomes an unbearable tragedy? The translation of the diary unfolded not as a story, but as a slow, toxic infusion into Samuel's consciousness. Jan's voice, a low, rasping instrument worn thin by hunger and despair, gave breath to the ghost of Miklos, the watchmaker. They sat in the relative quiet of the late afternoon, the sun doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in Samuel's bones. Jan would read a passage in Hungarian, his eyes scanning the precise script, pausing at certain entries as if steeling himself, then he would render the words into careful, heavily accented English. The entries began with the mundane, the desperate clinging to routine, the tally of daily rations, a description of a guard's face, the weather. But soon, the horror seeped in at the edges of the narrative, like bloodstains spreading through cloth. Miklos wrote of the selectia, the selections, where men and women were divided with a casual flick of a riding crop, left and right, life and a journey to the smoking chimneys. He described the Muselmanner, the walking dead, those who had given up, their eyes already vacant of this world, their bodies soon to follow. He documented the rumors that swept through the barracks like a fever, rumors of liberation, of advancing armies, rumors that were as necessary as bread and as cruel as the guards' clubs when they proved false. Then Jan's voice faltered. He had reached an entry dated earlier in the winter, a long, dense passage that seemed to have been written in a single, frantic sitting. The ink was darker, the script more jagged, as if the hand holding the pencil had been trembling. Jan took a slow, shaky breath. This is not about the camp, he said, his eyes meeting Samuel's with a new, profound dread. He writes of before, of when he was first taken. He was not brought here directly. Samuel leaned closer, the world of the camp, the smells, the distant sounds of bulldozers, the faint cries, seeming to recede, replaced by the chilling tableau Jan's translation began to paint. Miklos and his family, along with hundreds of others from their community, had been rounded up not by the regular army, but by special units, the Einsatzgruppen, that followed behind the front lines. They were forced on a long, brutal march east, away from the towns, deep into the Ukrainian countryside, to a place of isolated landscapes and vast, open pits. Jan's translation became a tunnel into a different kind of hell, one without the industrial efficiency of the camp, but with a raw, intimate brutality that was somehow even more terrifying. Miklos described a ravine, a great gash in the earth, its edges crowded with leafless trees. He wrote of the constant, flat crack of pistol shots, methodical, unhurried, one after another. He described being forced to stand at the edge of that pit, waiting his turn, watching the men and women and children ahead of him being made to strip, to kneel at the precipice, before the shot to the back of the head sent them tumbling forward into the mass of tangled, still warm bodies below. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood and freshly turned earth. He wrote of the faces of the shooters, men who took breaks to smoke cigarettes and eat sandwiches from their packs, their expressions bored, professional, as if they were factory workers on a production line. His own turn came. He was pushed forward, the cold mud of the edge under his bare feet. He felt the cold circle of the pistol's muzzle press against the base of his skull. He closed his eyes, waiting for the oblivion, the final, sharp crack. But it did not come. Instead, a shout, a command. They needed skilled laborers, a voice said. A watchmaker. Someone to repair the officer's timepieces. The pressure of the gun vanished. He was pulled back, shoved away from the pit, back toward the living. He opened his eyes and saw his wife, his two young daughters, still in the line, their faces pale and confused, looking at him. He saw the soldier raise his pistol again, not at him, but at them. And then Miklos had turned, and run, and was loaded onto a different truck, one bound for the camp, a place that, in that moment, he saw not as a death sentence, but as a reprieve. Jan stopped reading. The final words hung in the air, sharp and lethal as shrapnel. Samuel felt a physical wave of nausea. The systematic, factory-like killing of the camp was one kind of evil, a monstrous perversion of the modern world. But this was something older, more primal. It was personal. It was a man looking into the eyes of his family as a bullet entered their brains. It was the sound of a single pistol shot, not the industrial roar of a gas chamber. The silence that fell between Samuel and Jan was absolute. It was the silence of that ravine, after the shooting had stopped. Samuel looked down at his own hands, strong, capable hands that held a rifle, that could build a fire, that had once fixed a neighbor's fence back in Ohio. They were the hands of a liberator. But in the face of Miklós's memory, they felt useless. How did one liberate a man from that? How did one free a soul that had been forced to carry the image of its own murder, and the murder of everything it loved, for the rest of its days? The camp around them was a monument to a calculated, bureaucratic genocide, but the diary had just whispered of the other, older method, the one that required no complex infrastructure, just a pit, a pistol, and the willingness to look a human being in the eye as you extinguish their life. And in that moment, Samuel understood that the war had not been fought against an army, but against this very particular, very human capacity for cruelty. The question was no longer how such a thing could happen. The question, the one that would haunt him forever, was how the men who did it could then go back to their tents, and open their rations, and write letters home to their own families, their hands steady, their consciences clean. The order coming down as a relief and a curse in equal measure. They were to rejoin the main push, to become soldiers again in a war of bullets and territory, a war that now felt almost clean by comparison. The camp, with its haunting silence and its phantom population, receded behind them, but it did not disappear. It traveled with them, a persistent shadow in the eyes of every man, a shared sickness they carried in their guts. The diary was now Samuel's constant companion, a sacred and terrible relic wrapped in an oilcloth and stored in his breast pocket, a second heartbeat that was not his own. The road away from that place should have felt like an escape, but it was merely a transition from one form of dread to another. The war they re-entered was familiar, yet utterly transformed. The crack of a sniper's rifle no longer just signaled danger, it echoed the casual pistol shots in Miklós's ravine. The sight of a dead German soldier in a ditch was no longer a simple testament to their marksmanship, it was a body, a life ended, and it brought back the memory of the skeletal figures being pushed into mass graves by bulldozers. Samuel functioned on instinct, his training taking over where his mind refused to go, but he moved like a man asleep, the world around him muffled and distant, the vibrant, brutal colors of combat faded to a monochrome gray. They found themselves billeted for a single night in a captured German town, its inhabitants hiding behind locked doors, the air still thick with the dust of collapsed buildings. Samuel's squad was assigned a cellar, damp and cold, but safe from the sporadic artillery falling elsewhere in the valley. It was here, in the flickering light of a single candle, that the dam finally broke. The men were quiet, eating their rations without tasting them, the usual banter and dark humor extinguished. Someone, a young replacement who had not been at the camp, tried to start a song, a soft, homesick melody from Georgia. The tune was gentle, a memory of porch swings and fireflies, but in the oppressive silence of the cellar, it felt like a violation. Samuel felt a heat rise in his chest, a sudden, uncontrollable wave of fury. "Shut up," he muttered, his voice low and thick. The replacement didn't hear him, lost in his own memory, and sang another line. "Shut up," Samuel roared, lurching to his feet, his fists clenched. The cellar fell deathly silent. All eyes were on him. The replacement stared, his face a mask of shock and fear. Samuel stood there, trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the image of the singing boy superimposed over the hollow faces of the camp, over Miklós's family standing at the edge of the pit. The dissonance was too much. The beauty of the song, the memory of a normal world, felt like a lie, an insult to the dead. He stumbled out of the cellar, up into the cold night air, leaning against the shattered brickwork of a wall, vomiting until there was nothing left but bile and the bitter taste of shame. He found himself alone on what was once a main street, the cobblestones torn up by tank treads. The moon was high and cold, casting a silver light on the wreckage. He sank down onto a pile of rubble, the stone cold against his legs, and pulled the diary from his pocket. He didn't need Jan to translate it anymore. He knew its weight, its shape, the feel of the stained cloth cover. He held it in his hands and finally allowed himself to weep. They were not clean tears of sadness, but great, heaving sobs that racked his entire body, tears of rage, of confusion, of a profound and irredeemable loss. He was not crying for Miklós, or for the millions, not in that moment. He was crying for himself, for the death of the boy from Ohio who had believed in a world of simple right and wrong, who had gone to war with a clear heart and a belief in the cause. That boy was gone, left behind in the mud and the ashes of that camp, and what remained was this hollowed-out man, trembling in the ruins of a foreign town, holding the ghost of a watchmaker. He understood now that liberation was not an end, it was a beginning. It was the moment the infection entered the bloodstream. They had opened the gates, but the horror had not stayed inside, it had poured out, and now it was inside of them, a part of them forever. The war would end, he felt it in his bones, the machinery was grinding to a halt, but their war, the war for their own souls, was just beginning. How could they ever go home? How could they sit at a kitchen table, listen to music, hold a woman's hand, with the knowledge of that pit, of that smoke, living inside them? The silence of the night offered no answer, only the distant, mocking echo of the artillery, a sound that was now a comforting reminder of a simpler, more honest kind of hell. The end of the war in Europe did not come with a bang, but with a slow, uncertain fading. The news of the surrender traveled through the ranks not as a jubilant shout, but as a low, weary murmur, a rumor that was too immense to be believed until they saw it with their own eyes. White sheets hanging from windows, German soldiers in ragged columns trudging eastward with their hands on their heads, the sudden, unnerving absence of gunfire. For Samuel and the men of his company, stationed now in a small, shell-pocked Austrian village, the silence was the most profound sound they had ever heard. It was a physical pressure on the eardrums, a void where for years there had been the constant, background roar of violence. They lit no bonfires, they fired no weapons into the air in celebration. They sat on the steps of the houses they had occupied, or stood quietly by the roadside, watching the defeated enemy walk past, and they felt nothing but a vast, hollow exhaustion. The war was over, but the world they had saved felt alien and broken, and the men who had done the saving felt like ghosts haunting it. Samuel found himself standing by a narrow river that ran clear and cold through the village, watching the water swirl around the mossy stones. He could see his reflection, a gaunt, older face under a helmet that was now too large for him. The boy from Ohio was a photograph, a memory of a memory. Weeks later, the machinery of the army began to turn, this time toward demobilization. There were forms to fill out, equipment to be returned, a slow, bureaucratic unwinding of the Great War machine. Samuel was processed, stamped, and assigned to a transport ship. The journey across the Atlantic was a surreal inversion of the one that had brought him to Europe. Then, the ships had been tense, silent arcs full of fear and resolve, cutting through the water toward an unknown fate. Now, the same vessels were floating carnivals of relief, of men laughing too loudly, drinking too much, their voices straining to fill the silence left by the guns. Samuel kept to himself, spending hours on the deck, leaning against the railing, watching the endless, gray expanse of the ocean. The diary was still in his pocket, a part of his uniform now, as essential as his dog to find Miklos's family, to send it back to whatever remained of Debrecen, but he knew, with a certainty that felt like a stone in his gut, that there was no one left to send it to. The diary's journey ended with him. He was its final keeper. New York Harbor was a shock to the system. The skyline, whole and towering, the Statue of Liberty, green and implacable, the shrill cries of seagulls, it was a world of impossible scale and noise and wholeness. The cheers that erupted from the ship as it docked were deafening, a raw, physical wave of sound that made Samuel flinch. He walked down the gangplank with his duffel bag, his feet unsteady on the solid, unmoving ground. There were bands playing, women kissing soldiers, reporters with flashing cameras. The joy was palpable, a force of nature, and he moved through it like a man in a glass box, able to see it all, but completely separate from it. He followed the flow of humanity to a train station, and then he was on a train, watching America unspool outside his window, towns with intact houses, children playing in yards, laundry hanging on lines. It was a picture of peace, a diorama of the life he was supposed to be returning to. But every telephone pole looked like a watchtower, every distant factory smokestack sent a jolt of primal fear through his nerves, and the smell of coal smoke from the train's engine was, for a horrifying second, the smell of the camp. He arrived at his hometown station on a Tuesday afternoon. It was smaller than he remembered, the platform quieter. And then he saw them. His mother and father, standing there, older, their faces etched with years of worry that were now melting into an incredulous joy. They rushed toward him, and he dropped his duffel bag, and they embraced him, his mother sobbing into his uniform jacket, his father clapping him on the back, his own eyes wet. He held them, feeling the solid, real weight of them, and for a single, fleeting moment, the glass box shattered, and he was there, truly home. But as they pulled apart, as his mother looked up at his face, her smile faltered just for an instant. She was looking into his eyes, and he knew what she saw there. She saw the distance. She saw the shadow. That night, sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the familiar smells of his mother's cooking, listening to his father talk about the factory, he felt the diary in the pocket of the fresh set of clothes he wore. It was no longer a physical object, but a depth charge that had already detonated deep within him, reshaping the very geology of his soul. He was home, in the room where he had grown up, but he was also standing in the mud of that camp, and in the moonlit ruins of that German town, and at the edge of Miklósa's ravine. He had come back from the war, but the war had not left him. It had taken up residence inside, a silent, permanent garrison, and he knew, with a cold and absolute certainty, that the truce he would have to negotiate with it would last for the rest of his life. The world had moved on, celebrating its victory, but he carried its true, terrible cost within him, a quiet, enduring weight in the pocket over his heart.